Kira is going to introduce Abby for the next presentation here.
Right now, we'll have Abbey Witham with her presentation, The Birth of a New Revolution, #Roads Must Fall, and students' calls for transformational decolonization as a shift in South African student activism.
Thank you, Keith, for that introduction. Thank y'all for coming in person too. This is fun. So like he said, my title of my presentation is The Birth of a New Revolution, Roads Must Fall, and Students' Calls for Transformational Decolonization as a Shift in South African Student Activism. The Roads Must Fall movement started on March 9th, 2015, when a student at University of Cape Town, or UCT, Makalele, did a radical protest against the statue of Cecil John Rhodes, who was a vehement white supremacist and colonialist. On his way to campus on March 9th, Makalele picked up a bucket of human waste that was on the side of the road on his way into campus, and frustrated all of the pain and suffering that the statue of Rhodes represented. He threw the bucket of excrement on the statue, screaming, "Where are our heroes and ancestors?" This radical protest by Makalele started a movement on the UCT campus for the statue's removal, and students continued to deface it and protest, calling for Rhodes to fall. Hence, Rhodes must fall. The statue, to the surprise of some, was removed on April 9th, 2015, just 1 month after Makalele's initial protest. The removal of that statue in the beginning of the physical decolonization of campus led to a wider student movement calling for the decolonization of the institution as a whole. My research question for this project is, how did Roads Must Fall at the University of Cape Town differ from other South African student movements? And my thesis is, through calls for the physical, cultural, and curricular decolonization of universities, the Roads Must Fall movement marks a shift in post-apartheid student activism. Moving beyond protests within transitional restrictions to protests actively questioning the inaction of university administration, students pushed UCT towards the full post-apartheid transformation that was promised. So I'm really trying to locate this new type of student activism within the history of South African student activism. In order to do so, here's a brief overview of the history of South African student activism. So during the apartheid era, student activism was located in what's known as the, quote, master narrative of liberation. So student movements were a part of the larger liberation movement fighting against apartheid, as opposed to fighting for their own unique demands and change that they wanted to see in their universities. With the coming of democracy in 1994, students for the first time were able to push for their own changes within universities outside this larger liberation context. But instead, promises for change became, following the lead of Nelson Mandela and the ANC and their transition to democracy, universities really focused on appeasement and compromise during that transitional period in the first 20 years after the end of apartheid. And students coming fresh off this liberation movement had just gained freedom, took a step back, and gave universities the time and the space to act on the promises that they had made. 2008 marks a really pivotal year for UCT in particular, because that was the year that their Vice Chancellor, Dr. Max Price, was installed. Vice Chancellor is basically their university president. During his installation address, Dr. Price indicated that there were a lot of changes that needed to be made at UCT in order to bring it into a more fully transformed university. We talked in specifics, talking about hiring more diverse faculty members, but really highlight the fact that no change had really been made. This transitional period had really just been appeasement and compromise, and there hadn't been any push for change. Along with the installation of Dr. Max Price in the early to mid-2010s, a new generation of South Africans were coming into university, and that's born-free students. In South Africa, born-frees is the generational title given to South Africans born after liberation. So after 1994 or who grew up after 1994 outside of the direct oppression of apartheid. And so although they don't take freedom necessarily for granted at all, they have a different perspective on it, and they're more willing to challenge and question inaction and question the promises made at the start of democracy. And it was those questions and that pushing back against university inaction that really came to the forefront during Rhodes Must Fall in 2015. Scholarship surrounding Rhodes Must Fall has really fallen into three categories, and that's really the context, causes, and consequences of Rhodes Must Fall. And while these discourses are all very important and really necessary, none of them really placed Rhodes Must Fall within the wider scope of South African student activism, and so that's where my argument comes in here. I believe that Rhodes Must Fall isn't just another isn't just another wave of student activism protesting for something, but it's a different, entirely new type of student activism that actively questions the status quo and is questioning the promises that have been made. And I will be making my argument through the analysis of tweets, interviews, speeches, and journal articles. Physical decolonization was the most visible type of colonization at UCT, and it really was made up of physical statues around campus and also the names of buildings around campus that were named after white supremacists and white colonialists. These statues and names really glorified these men, they were mostly men, glorified the white supremacists and were a really physical reminder of UCT's past and the lack of transformation at the university. Makwele's initial radical protest, they called the Poo protest, was really motivated, as he said in interviews in 2015, by his trauma and pain that statue of John Cecil Rhodes represented. That same trauma and pain caused by colonial and apartheid era monuments harmed students of color, Black students especially, and was talked about as well by a senior researcher and Rhodes Must Fall member, Zechi Matabene, saying, quote, "It's really about the everyday psychic manipulation that enforces one's complicity in glorifying and celebrating statues of colonial conquerors and perpetrators as heroes." The Rhodes Must Fall Student Collective and individual students echoed this same sentiment, saying at the bottom here, quote, "This presence, which represents South Africa's history of dispossession and exploitation of Black people, is an act of violence against Black students, workers, and staff." And then in her tweet here, Carl Roberts states, quote, "If the Rhodes Must Fall statue doesn't bother you, the future is moving faster than your consciousness." So here students are really calling for the statue's removal and calling out the harm that the statues and the glorification of white supremacists enacts upon its Black students and other students of color. And they're highlighting that adding other stories around these statues, creating more memorials to Black leaders or other minority groups within South Africa, doesn't diminish the harm being done to students by these statues of white supremacists, and decolonization and the removal of these statues, the changing of these names, is the only way to reverse this process of continued oppression. Physical decolonization was also used as a catalyst for wider movements for decolonization around campus. This protest in 2015 was the first successful protest for the statue's removal at UCT. And students used that to jumpstart conversations around the more invisible systems working to continue colonialism and like apartheid era policies within the university. Rhodes Must Fall highlighted this, saying that the removal of the statue was the natural starting point of this movement. The removal of the statue will not be the end of this movement, but rather the beginning of the decolonization of the university. And again, individual students also echoed this sentiment in tweets, saying, quote, "I really hope that now people understand that it's not just about the statue." And Rihanna Odendahl saying here, "The statue is not coming down just because of what Rhodes did 100 years ago, but what has not happened yet." So again, students are actively questioning what hasn't happened yet at the university. That's why we're protesting. We're protesting this inaction. We're calling the university out for this inaction and really pushing them to take the steps towards transformation. Cultural decolonization really existed within the University of Cape Town in colonial sentiments and patterns that existed within the institution's culture. For the purpose of my presentation and my paper, I'm defining institutional culture as the university's social and administrative norms, both socially and organizationally. One of the main motivating factors for wanting cultural decolonization that students highlighted was the university's inadequate recognition of institutional racism and white privilege at UCT, kind of invisible systems that were still operating in the same way as during apartheid. Christina Paler, who is a researcher at UCT, spoke really eloquently on this point, saying, quote, "The awkward realization is that I find myself at an institution in which the structures, policies, and processes work, but at a level that is relevant and acceptable to only those people, like myself, who have been less concerned with meaningful change and with a focus on, quote, getting the work done." So her opinion article, that's what this is from, really highlights the inequalities and the unchanged systems at UCT and an administration that pays, quote, lip service, as the former professor said, to transformation as opposed to taking the actual steps towards creating that transformation. And these students who were living within this unwelcoming, unequal culture demonstrated around campus to call attention to it, to call attention to two sides of the same coin, as Francis Nyanjo says, which are white privilege and institutional racism, which perpetuates Black pain. You can see from these photos from a tweet by student Adam Way, students protesting around campus with tape over their mouths and their hands, and signs saying to help me break free from white privilege for white students or institutional racism for students of color. With these protests, these students are really, again, making these invisible systems and patterns like visible and impossible to ignore for the University of Cape Town administration, and highlighting that inequality and racism was still actively happening at UCT. It wasn't something that got left alone or left behind when democracy came. They were still acting to oppress students. And they really were getting tired of it, and they wanted the university to acknowledge that it was there as the first step towards transformation and decolonization. Another aspect of cultural decolonization is the acknowledgement of Black pain. This Black pain is caused by, like I talked about, the glorification of white supremacists, the glorification of colonizers, the unequal representation in the university, and the untransformed systems like institutional racism, white privilege, all that jazz. Roads Must Fall and the Student Collective talked about this in their mission statement, quote, saying, quote, "At the root of this struggle is the dehumanization of Black people at UCT, a violence exacted only against Black people by a system that privileges whiteness. It is crucial that this movement flows from the Black voices and Black pain that have been continuously ignored and silenced." So this historically ignored and silenced students continue to happen after apartheid in these untransformed systems and patterns and institutions, because students weren't given the space to feel this pain. That can only come through decolonization. Students cannot acknowledge something that's being continually impressed upon them. You can't acknowledge a pain that you are still experiencing. And so students were calling for decolonization and for the university's recognition of this pain being caused to Black students, and calling for decolonization as a space for students to begin to heal and come to terms with the pain that they've been feeling for years and years and years. Curricular decolonization was also a major call for students at UCT. And UCT was originally a white-only institution, and so its curriculum was very, very westernized and Eurocentric, and had talked about Africa and South Africa in very stereotypically negative lights, as a lot of westernized curriculums do. And that hadn't changed, again, like these other systems, since the end of apartheid. Manchu had a theory, he's a sociology professor at UCT, that this curriculum hadn't changed because changing the curriculum would mean white faculty giving up their power. And so that's kind of one of the motivating reasons why this curriculum wasn't changing at all, despite student protests. And students, in response to this inaction, had a simple assertion, represented by Mukonto here, saying, quote, "UCT is not going to leave Africa. Africans must take over UCT." It's really talking about centering Black voices and Black scholarship and Black experiences within the curriculum as well. And that centering of Black voices starts with the diversification of the faculty. In a study done by Manchu in 2014, he found that only 5 out of 174 lecturers at UCT were Black, which is 2.8% of the faculty at the university, and none of them were women. This lack of representation is also echoed by students such as Binyaki here, who says, in my 4 years and few months at UCT, I've only been lectured by 2 Black South African lecturers. So this university, located in Africa, who prides itself in being an African university, only had 2% of its professors who were actually Black Africans. This was a direct calling out of this empty promise by Dr. Max Price, who in his 2008 installation address had promised to hire more Black lecturers and diversify the faculty. And Born Freeze, again, called him out on this and said, hey, this hasn't been done. Why hasn't this been done? We're going to pressure you to fulfill this promise and move from a transitionary period, whatever that means, into a transformation period, into where we see ourselves more in the curriculum and we see our experiences more in the curriculum. Curricular decolonization also called for the decolonization of what scholarship and knowledge was valued by UCT, which had been historically white scholarship and white knowledge. And so students called for them to center Black scholarship and Black knowledge instead. Rhodes Westphal called their student collective mission statement calls here again for UCT to, quote, implement a curriculum which critically centers Africa and the subaltern. By this we mean treating African discourses as the point of departure through addressing not only content, but languages and methodologies of education and learning, and only examining Western traditions insofar as that they are relevant to our own experience. So here they're really calling for an inversion of the curriculum, where at UCT it had mostly been centering Western knowledge and drawing on African knowledge as needed, and students were saying, hey, that's not going to work, we need to center African knowledge and draw on Western knowledge as needed instead. And centering Black scholars' history and experiences would lessen the alienation that Black students felt in their classes. They would see themselves more in their curriculum. And it would also stop the cycle of the devaluation of Black scholarship and Black students. And it would also just allow UCT to be a truly African university that really valued its community, valued its students, valued its faculty, and valued its location. Again, my thesis for this project is through calls for physical, cultural, and curricular decolonization of universities, the Rhodes Westphal movement marks a shift in post-apartheid student activism, moving beyond protests within transitional restrictions to protest questioning the inaction of university administration. Students pushed UCT towards the full post-apartheid transformation that was promised. I believe that examining Rhodes Westphal within this broader context allows scholars to view this movement not just as another wave of student activism protesting for something, but rather a new kind of student activism led by Born Free students that actively questions the status quo and the promises of democracy. Students kept this pressure up on the university, calling out inaction, calling for transformational change that was promised and then not delivered on. I believe that seeing Rhodes Westphal as a new wave of student activism sets it apart as a successful movement driven by students' voices and demands for change. And then it becomes the precedent for post-apartheid student activism and actively reshapes how scholars and everyday citizens understand students' modern calls for radical decolonization. Thank you. Anyone has any questions?
Hey, Abby, great job. Thank you so much for your presentation. I was wondering, I'm so interested in your use of tweets as one of your primary sources, and I feel like doing the kind of work that future historians will be doing, analyzing these kinds of sources. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about using Twitter as an archive and how you found and interpreted these kinds of sources.
Yeah, it was really weird, first of all, because I never really thought of Twitter as an archive. But I figured that would be a really good place to find individual student voices. Talking to Professor Brittany Merritt-Nash, she was my co-sponsor, and she really pushed me to try to find both collective student voices, so the voices of student organizations like the Rhodes Westphal Student Collective, coming together as a group, but then also individual voices, and I felt that Twitter would be the best place to find those individual voices, especially since this happened just 6 years ago. So Twitter was definitely a major part of that. So I found out that there's an advanced search tool on Twitter that allows you to search individual hashtags, individual accounts. And so I was searching hashtags Rhodes Westphal, hashtag Occupy Bremner, hashtag transform UCT, all of these different kind of calls to action that came from this one movement for decolonization. And there weren't as many as I thought there were going to be, but there was still a wide variety of student voices and student perspectives that came from that. And since there were tweets, they're fairly quick to read through and to analyze, because I had to read through pages and pages of like diary entries or analysis or anything. So it ended up being really fun to hear directly from student voices. Twitter is fairly unfiltered most of the time, so people really will tell you how they feel on it, and so it was really fun to look back on. Yes, Annie.
I'd jump in off of that because I'm really curious about sort of your research process in general, because, and I really like to look at your bibliography if you're willing to share it.
Yes.
Because the sense that I got is you've essentially decolonized your research and your sources as well. And I'm curious if you could talk about it. I don't know if that was intentional, maybe it was, but, oh no, send it to me. I'm going to take way more time on that. But if that was intentional, or if that sort of developed alongside your thesis, or how maybe those interplayed with the kinds of sources that you were using, and then the topic you ended up, I don't want to say deciding on, but coming to.
Mm-hmm. No, yeah, definitely. That's a great question. And that's not really something that I've thought about in that way before, but it's definitely, using lots of things coming straight from students, not necessarily focusing on administration. And that's something that I purposely did, because there has been more scholarship done about administrative responses to Rhodes Must Fall, and not necessarily students' voices within it pushing for change. And so that's something else that I love about history, is that it's like the stories of individuals as well. And so I really wanted to go straight to those individuals and hear what they had to say, as opposed to people who have had a longer time to kind of sit and think about it. But yeah, that's really fascinating to think about. Not necessarily using the administration's what they think happened and what they think students wanted, but going straight to students and seeing what they actually wanted, straight from the source. Hopefully that answered your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Abby, thanks so much for your presentation. I'm really interested in this, in your analysis of student activism over time, and how their methods have changed, how their motivations and their goals have changed. And I was curious if you saw any generational critique in some ways. Were any of the recent students critical in some ways of those who sort of said, okay, we're gonna give some space during this transitional time? Did you sense any of that student critique of other student activists?
Yeah, definitely calls by these born-free students kind of questioning the inaction of the universities, but also kind of the inaction of previous students, and saying, maybe this is kind of why there hasn't been anything done, is you guys haven't been pressing on this for as long. There's definitely more of that aimed towards the administration and the university, but I think that comes from the born-free generation as well, just being less scared, that's not really the right word, but to question things and to call things out and to call out inaction, because they didn't experience for themselves what that fight for liberation was like and what it felt like once it finally came. And so they were more far removed from that, and so because of that, maybe questioning, oh, well, I don't really know what it was like, but you probably could have kept pushing along that line more. But definitely more aimed towards university, but definitely still some, I wonder what could have been done sooner. Thank you.
Thanks, Abby.
Yes,
I had kind of the opposite question. I was wondering about how the previous era of activists felt about the born-free Rhodes Must Fall. Were they feeling like the new student movements were ungrateful? How did they feel? Did they get mainstream support from, you know, the ANC and different groups like that?
Yeah, there's definitely been a lot of backlash against these protests, and that comes because they have gotten very violent. In the past few years, the initial protests weren't very violent, but going into the fall of 2016, or fall of 2015, spring of 2016, they got really violent. And that was condemned by the women's leaders, obviously, saying that that's not the right way to go about things. But that definitely didn't help their cause by the wider population of South Africa, saying these students are protesting for something that isn't going to come. The big movement now that's spurred from Rose Must Fall is Fees Must Fall, calling for free education in South Africa. And so a lot of other South Africans are saying that's not really feasible. Why are they protesting this? Things were better before. They should be grateful that they have education in the first place, coming from those people who fought the liberation struggle and said, hey, we fought really hard for them to be here in the first place. Why are they fighting their universities now? So there's definitely kind of back and forth between the generations saying, hey, well, we're pressing for more transformation. Nothing has been done since liberation and things should be done. And then those older generations saying, but things have been done for you. So yeah, definitely back and forth. Dr. Schroeder, I saw you had a question as well.
Thank you. Jonathan, do we still have time? What's our schedule? I can hold the question.
Well, I think we could do one more question, and then we should probably take a 5-minute break because we're just a little bit behind time. Dr. Schroeder, ask your question, and then we'll take a break after Abbey answers it.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Abbey. That was really very interesting. So here's a chance to apply history to the present. A number of us, I think probably you as well, attended the Indigenous Students Association meeting. I think it was last Wednesday. And so right here on our own campuses, we have students calling for decolonization. So given your work, what would you suggest would be steps toward decolonization at St. Ben's and St. John's?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I actually got so excited while listening to that panel because it related to what my project was about. And it's right here on our campuses. I think what the ISA calling for recognition of Indigenous students on campus and for a greater representation of them on campus is a really good first step. Acknowledging that we do have Native students on campus and they do have a voice and that they do have a story, calling for that center for students to go and get help. That relates kind of to that recognition of Black pain during Rose Must Fall. Giving Indigenous students a place to acknowledge their own pain and the things that they have gone through within a community here would be great as well. And I think increasing classes about Indigenous history as well, incorporating more kind of how the students in Rose Must Fall were calling for the centering of Black voices. I think we should also center Indigenous voices within our own curriculums and really pay attention to what they have to say as well as what our other curriculum is too.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thanks, Ellie.
Thanks, Ellie.
Well, thank you, everyone. Why don't